Now, lying next to the body of one of the men who blew themselves up outside the Stade de France last Friday was a Syrian passport. It belonged to a man who Greek officials have confirmed passed through Greece along with the thousands of migrants. So-called Islamic State had threatened to place jihadis amongst fleeing refugees, and some, including UKIP leader Nigel Farage, believe this is exactly what has happened and that this security threat now needs to be closed off.
This dream of the free movement of people, this dream for others of the Schengen area, hasn't just meant the free movement of people, it's meant the free movement of Kalashnikov rifles, it's meant the free movement of terrorists, and it's meant the free movement of jihadists. And it's time that democratic groups in Britain and right across Europe stood up and fought and gained in strength and said, an end to this. We want back border controls. We want back national security.
Nigel Farage. Well, here now is Peter Whittle, the UKIP candidate for London Mayor. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Is Nigel Farage cynically using the Paris attacks to try and forward UKIP's domestic agenda?
Absolutely not. There's no question about this. This is a hugely political issue, so a political response is necessary. And I find it extraordinary that people say that this is being exploitative and what have you. Nigel's speech last night, I was there, was hugely nuanced and indeed very positive in some of the messages it put out. But the fact is people want and need to talk about this situation. There were 1,000 people there last night. Everyone wants to talk about one of the most serious issues facing us. So what you don't do is somehow just simply avoid it or deny that things are happening.
Right. I mean, one of the quotes, some British Muslims, Nigel Farage said, are conflicted in their loyalties between the UK way of life and what some elements within their faith are telling them. Do you agree with that?
I would say that there's a large amount of truth in that. I have to point out that Nigel used one example, which was at 27%. In fact, in other words, he was not talking about all Muslims in Britain. He was talking about a small amount of Muslims who basically showed that after the Charlie Hebdo attacks early this year, again in Paris, there was a significant support, about 27%, for the motives of those killers. Now, that is very, very worrying indeed. So we have to sort of face up to those things. It's up to us really to put forward a much stronger narrative as to why all people in Britain, should have their allegiance first and foremost to this country.
What do you say to that?
Well, I don't believe that British Muslims are conflicted. I think you don't love your first child any less if you have a second. I think that the vast majority of Muslims feel very British, very much want their families safe. They don't want anything to do with ISIS. ISIS is a cult created by Saddam Hussein's henchmen. They're scared of them in the same way that you and I are scared of them. And I think we shouldn't be confusing migration with refugees. And also, it has to be said, we're not taking one person that's actually come to Europe. We're taking them from the UN camps in the region. And they've been properly vetted, and they're the most vulnerable people. They're victims of rape, victims of torture, victims of brutality.
But that's absolutely right. I mean, no one's arguing about that. I don't think Nigel's arguing about that. That's the right way to do it.
Except Nigel Farage did say, didn't he, that there would be jihadis secreted in the fleeing refugees from Syria, and that would be a threat.
But he's not the only one who said that.
No, but
Lebanese ministers said it, Jordanian people said it to David Cameron. But at the time, if you said this at the time, when this huge migration started, you were pretty much dismissed, but he was right.
Right. Was Nigel Farage right? Because there are fears, genuine fears, that when you see those pictures of the vast numbers of people coming from that war-torn area in the Middle East, that surely there is a very high risk that it would be an opportune way to smuggle jihadis in.
Again, I trust our vetting processes, because we are the British. We're vetting.
But into Europe, into continental Europe, you know, Paris is where the attacks happened. Angela Merkel has opened the doors to some people's minds within her own sort of ministerial cabinet have said it was the wrong thing to do.
Well, my understanding is that virtually all, except for one perhaps, of the French terrorists were French-born or lived in France or Belgium. And so I think that again, it's a bit of a red herring. Yes, there will be undoubtedly people that will go under the cloak of whatever process there is in order to get in to carry out their nefarious acts. But that's our job our job, the British security services, British policing's job, to make sure they don't do what we...
And the attacks in Paris, Peter Whittle, were carried out by 8 people, none of whom were British. So, in a way, associating those terrorists in any way with the 3 million or so Muslims in Britain will be seen, or could be seen, as provocative or unnecessarily stirring up emotion.
Absolutely not. I totally reject this. The fact is, it's not like we haven't been affected by this ourselves. You know, we had Lee Rigby virtually decapitated. We had 7/7, right? We've had attacks. So it is
from homegrown terrorists.
Yes, exactly. But the thing is that you can't conflate, in a way, the two issues when, in fact, they're broadly born of the same cause. And the truth is to say, for example, that it's a red herring that just one of them came from outside France, I find extraordinarily complacent that you can say that.
Far from complacency. Obviously, they'll investigate where... I understand that it might well be a false passport in any event. So they'll find out where he comes from, whether or not he came through the migration route. But obviously, we as the security forces, we as Britons, will have the opportunity to assess whether or not they should be here and make sure that those that shouldn't be here aren't allowed in.
Right. I mean, just briefly, though, to pick up on the statistic that Peter Whittle used, 27% of British Muslims said they had some sympathy for the motives behind the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris in January. Is that worrying?
Very worrying that anybody might think that. I mean, I personally believe that, you know, we should not worry about whether or not people want to take the proverbial out of our faith. Faith is about me and my religion. It's not about me and the rest of the public. So I would not welcome anybody saying that people should be harmed or hurt because they've taken or they abuse us or criticise us in some way.
But 27% of British Muslims do.
Well, yes. That's a survey. That's whatever that might be the case. The reality is, I know from talking to dozens and dozens around the country, that's not what they believe. Again, they are British. They were British. They were Muslim victims of the terrorism in Paris.
No one's denying that. But the fact is, I think you should agree that we should talk about this.
I have no problem with talking about it, and I'll be doing that this afternoon in London.
And should we take more refugees, Syrian refugees?
My personal belief is that we have a responsibility, a moral duty. These people are actually fleeing the fascist regime that is ISIS. And we wouldn't... You know, back in the 30s, we didn't say to the Jews, don't come here, go back to Hitler. We should be doing exactly the same thing with these refugees.
Actually, there were... a lot of British Jews were turned back, apart from the Kinder transport.
We shouldn't have done it then,
one can't use that comparison. I think it's a completely different situation.
All right, we'll end it there. Thank you.